Some of us have heard stories like this before. A young woman with nothing left, a forgotten piece of land, a secret buried where no one thought to look. We've told a few of those stories ourselves. But this one is different. This one belongs to a girl named Della Voss, and it begins not with drama but with silence. The particular silence of a front door that does not open, no matter how long you stand on the other side of it. She was 22 years old, and everything she owned fit inside a canvas shoulder bag with a broken buckle she'd fixed with a piece of wire. Inside that bag, 2 changes of clothes, a jar of dried herbs wrapped in newsprint, a folded piece of oilskin that doubled as a rain cover, and a Cooper's crows, a small hand tool with a walnut handle so worn that the wood had taken on the color and smoothness of old bone. The crows had belonged to Edna Marsh, and Della had carried it every day for 3 years, without once using it, without thinking of Edna's hands. If you stay with us, this story is worth hearing all the way to the end. Della Voss was born in the spring of 1878 in a rented house on the edge of Harlan County, Kentucky, the only child of a coal loader named Virgil Voss and a woman named Lena who had come down from Ohio to marry him and spent the rest of her short life regretting neither the man nor the marriage, only the distance from her own mother's kitchen. Lena died of a lung fever when Della was 6, and what Della remembered of her was not her face. Photographs were not a thing their family had, but her smell. Flour and rosewater and the faint mineral sharpness of the well water she used to wash her hair. Virgil Voss was not a bad man. He was a tired one. He loaded coal 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and came home with black embedded in the creases of his knuckles that no amount of lye soap could fully remove. He was not a man who knew how to raise a daughter, and he did not pretend otherwise. What he did was feed her and keep a roof over her head and trust that she was smart enough to figure out the rest. She was. By the time she was 9, Della cooked their meals and kept their accounts, such as they were, in a composition book she'd found in the street. By 11, she had read every book in the county lending library twice. By 13, she had begun walking 2 miles east along the creek road to sit with a woman named Edna Marsh, who lived alone in a timber frame house and ran the only cooperage in 3 counties from a workshop built onto the back of it. Edna Marsh was 64 when Della first appeared at her door, asking if she could watch, not help, just watch. Edna had considered the girl for a long moment, her steady eyes, her calloused hands, the way she stood with her weight evenly distributed, the way a person stands when they've learned early that the ground can shift. And then she had stepped aside and let her in. What Edna made was barrels, not decorative ones. Working barrels, whiskey casks, salt pork barrels, flour drums, water butts for farms that still drew from wells. She made them the old way, with white oak staves split along the grain for strength, hoops of white ash bent over steam, heads fitted to a tolerance so precise that a finished barrel could hold liquid for decades without a single drop lost. It was not glamorous work. It smelled of wet wood and iron, and the particular sweetness of oak shavings, and it left your hands permanently stained at the grain lines and your forearms ropey, with muscle you didn't ask for. Della fell in love with it completely. Edna did not teach her the way a school teacher teaches, with sequence and explanation and patience. She taught by doing, and she expected Della to keep up or ask questions, and she had no use for questions that could be answered by paying closer attention. Della paid close attention. Within a year, she could select a white oak stave by feel and know whether it would hold. Within 2, she could raise a barrel alone, set the staves in the truss hoop, work them into the raising hoops, coax the wood into its curve over the fire without cracking a single piece. By 15, she could cooperage a 30-gallon flour drum to Edna's exacting standard, which was the highest standard Della had ever encountered in any field of human endeavor. Edna paid her in learning and in the occasional meal, and Della understood that this was a fair exchange. What she was receiving could not be priced. It was not a skill exactly. It was a way of seeing, the way a stave wanted to curve, the way a hoop told you when it had been driven too hard, the way a finished barrel, when you tapped it with your knuckle, gave back a sound that was either right or wasn't, and if you had to ask which it was, you weren't ready yet. Virgil Voss died in a mine collapse in October of 1895, when Della was 17. There was no warning and no recovery. The company sent a letter 3 days later expressing condolences and noting that all outstanding wages had been settled against the company store tab. The amount owed to the Voss family was $0.14, which arrived in the mail in a small envelope with the company's seal on it. Della sat on the front step of the house for a long time after reading that letter. Not crying, just sitting, feeling the weight of the number. $0.14. and understanding that this was what a man's life added up to on paper, and that paper was the only ledger that would be kept. She was not entirely alone. Edna Marsh was still 2 miles east, and Della was there every morning for the next 3 years, working the Cooperage with a seriousness that had always been her nature, and was now her anchor. Edna did not speak much about grief, but she gave Della more work and harder work, and when Della did it well, which she nearly always did, Edna would say simply, "Yes, that's it." And in their shop, that was enough. Edna died in the summer of 1898 quickly of a heart that had been working hard for 67 years and simply decided it was done. She left the Cooperage tools to Della in a will written on the back of a barrel invoice and witnessed by Amos Kettridge, the county clerk, who said later that it was the most practical will he'd ever notarized. She left the house and land to a nephew in Knoxville, who appeared 3 weeks after the funeral to sell the property. He was 31, with soft hands and a pocket watch he checked frequently, and he had no interest in coopering or in Della Voss, who stood in the doorway of the workshop and watched him walk the property with a buyer from Harlan, and felt something close to the ground inside her give way. She packed what she could carry. The tools she was owed, which Edna had specified in the will, her own clothes, the dried herbs and the oilskin and the composition book she'd kept for years that now held not household accounts but notes, dramidas of different barrel types, wood grain observations, the temperatures at which different species bent without cracking, the angles at which a crow's seated cleanly. Everything Edna had taught her, in Della's own hand, and the crow's, the one with the walnut handle. Edna had used it for 40 years, and it fit Della's hand now, the way a thing fits that has been used long enough to become specific to the person using it. The nephew did not say goodbye. The buyer from Harlan was already measuring the workshop for something else. Della walked out the same way she had walked in 9 years earlier, weight evenly distributed, eyes forward. She had no family left in Harlan County. She had $4.60 saved in a tin box under the floorboard of the house she'd been renting by the month since her father died, a house whose landlord had already been notified she'd be leaving. She had her tools, her bag, her notes, and the crows. She also had a name that Edna had mentioned once, almost in passing. A town called Cotter's Mill, up in the Cumberland highlands of Tennessee, near a river valley where there was still timber being cut, and farms still using wooden barrels for everything from curing meat to storing water. Edna had said it as an observation, not an instruction. But Della had written it in the composition book, and now she looked at it and decided that it was close enough to a plan. She rode the train as far as her money allowed, which was to a depot called Redbud Crossing, and then walked. 2 days. The second day, it rained. She slept the first night in an empty church, with the door left unlocked in the practice of country churches everywhere, and she was grateful for the roof in a way she would not have been able to articulate the week before, and could articulate clearly now. Cotter's Mill was not much, a grist mill that still operated when the creek ran high enough, a general merchandise run by a man named Luther Payne who was 62, and moved as though every joint in his body had been tightened slightly past comfortable. A blacksmith, a church, a schoolhouse used twice a week, and a scattering of farms, in the hollows, and along the creek bottoms that had been there since before the Civil War, and intended to remain long after. Luther Payne looked at Della the way people in small places look at a young woman who arrives alone with a bag on her shoulder. Not unkindly, but carefully, taking inventory of what they could and couldn't read. She told him she was a cooper. He looked at her hands, which told the same story she did, and said there hadn't been a working cooperage in the county since old Silas Greer had died 4 years back, and that the farms were making do with tin and ceramic, which neither worked as well nor lasted as long. He said there was a property on the far side of the ridge, the Greer place, in fact, that the county had been trying to sell for 3 years. The house was standing. The workshop was standing. There was a spring on the property that ran year-round. The price was $4. Della had $4.60. She asked if she could see it first. Luther Payne lent her his mule. The Greer property sat on a south-facing slope above a creek, accessed by a lane so overgrown that the mule pushed through sumac and blackberry cane the whole half-mile from the road. The house was a 2-room log structure with a stone chimney, a loft above, and a porch that had sagged at one corner where a post had rotted out. The roof was hand-split shingles, and perhaps a quarter of them had curled or blown free, leaving patches of daylight visible from inside. The floor was packed earth covered in decades of leaf fall, tracked in through a door that no longer latched. The workshop was different. Silas Greer had built it well, from the same local limestone he'd used for the chimney, with a wooden floor set on a foundation that had not moved. The windows were small and high on the walls, the way a working shop wants its windows, to bring in light without losing wall space for tools. The workbench ran the full length of the north wall, solid oak, 3 inches thick, anchored to the wall framing with iron bolts. The truss hoops hung from the ceiling joists. The stave molds were still there, stacked against the east wall, dusty but intact. Della stood in the middle of the workshop for a long time. She ran her hand along the workbench. She lifted a stave mold and turned it in her hands, checking the joints. She looked at the ceiling joists, which were hewn chestnut and showed no signs of weakness. She looked at the spring that ran into a stone trough just outside the shop door, clean water moving steadily over flat stones in a stream no wider than her forearm. She thought about what Edna Marsh had taught her, that the material told you what it was if you asked it honestly, that you did not impose your will on wood, or on water, or on a piece of work. You found the line it wanted to follow and you helped it go there. She thought about what Edna had said once about the valley near here. The timber, the farms, the need for cooperage. She thought about the stave molds on the wall and the workbench that had been waiting 4 years for someone to put their hands on it. She rode back to Luther Payne's store and counted out $4 on the counter. He wrote up the deed on a piece of store ledger paper and called his wife, Harriet, in from the back room to witness it. Harriet Payne was 57, with a face that had been shaped by weather and the habit of concern for other people. And she looked at Della the way a person looks at someone they are already deciding to help. "You're going to need a new post for that porch," she said. "I know," Della said. "Luther has locust posts in the barn." Luther Payne had not known he was going to give her a locust post until his wife said so, but he nodded as though he had been planning it all along. Della walked back up the lane to the Greer property, her property now. In the late afternoon, the deed folded in her coat pocket, the mule returned to Luther's barn. She carried her bag through the low door of the house and set it on the earth floor and stood there in the dimness, listening, weaned through the gaps in the roof shingles. The spring running outside, the creak of the porch settling, she thought. $4, the total of everything I have in the world, given to a county that hadn't found a better use for this place in 3 years. I must be one of them. She did not think it as a joke, exactly, but she felt something ease in her chest that had been tight since she walked out of Edna Marsh's workshop for the last time. There was no secret buried under the hearthstone. That was not this story. What Della found was something different, and in some ways harder to explain. She fixed the roof first. She could not do anything else until the house was dry. Luther Payne told her where the nearest sawmill was, 6 miles south along the creek road, and she walked it on a Tuesday, and came back with a bundle of shingles on her back and the address of a man named Corwin Fitch, who ran the mill and who owed Luther a favor, which Luther had transferred to Della in the manner of men who keep accounts in goodwill rather than money. Corwin Fitch turned out to be 55, with a sawyer's hearing loss and a carpenter's eye. And he looked at the roof and said he'd send 2 men on Thursday with enough shingles to finish it, which he did, and Della worked beside them. And by the 3rd day, they were treating her not as the person who had hired them, but as a member of the crew, which was the highest form of professional acceptance she had ever experienced. The porch post went in on a Wednesday, a locust pole from Luther Payne's barn. Set in a hole Della dug herself and packed with rubble and clay. It was not a beautiful post, but it was vertical and it was sound, and when she pushed against the porch roof to test it, the whole structure held without a tremor. She swept the house. She aired it. She cut and fit a new door latch from a piece of iron she found in the workshop, heated in the shop's forge and shaped on an anvil that was still in the corner where Silas Greer had left it, covered in rust that came off with wire brush and oil to reveal iron as sound as the day it was cast. She filled the gaps in the floor with clay she dug from the creek bank, tamped down and smoothed with a board until the surface was level and firm. Then she opened the workshop. She began with what she knew, a 30-gallon flour barrel. Built from white oak staves, she split herself from a log Corwin Fitch had set aside for her at the mill. The splitting took 2 days. The dressing took another. She worked by feel and by eye the way Edna had taught her, each stave jointed at a bevel precise enough that, when the assembly was raised in the truss hoop, the faces came together without gap. She bent the staves over a fire, built in the workshop's small forge, coaxing the wood around its curve with a patience that could not be hurried. She drove the hoops with a hammer and a driver, feeling for the moment when the sound changed from a tap to a ring, the sound of a hoop seated and holding. When she knocked the finished barrel on its head and tapped it with her knuckle, it gave back the sound she was listening for. She carried it to Luther Payne's store and set it on the counter. Luther looked at it without speaking for a moment, then went around the counter and pushed it on its bottom edge, rolling it in a circle, watching the way it tracked. He stopped it and pressed the head with both thumbs. He straightened up and said, "What do you want for it?" she told him. He told 2 people. Those 2 people told others. By the end of November, 6 weeks after she had carried her bag through the door of the Greer house, Della Voss had 4 orders. By February, she had 11. By spring, she had more work than she could do alone and had begun keeping a waiting list, which was a thing she had never imagined needing. The people who came were not sentimental about what she was doing. They were farmers and mill workers, and a woman named Ottiline Vreeland, who kept a tavern at the crossroads and needed new beer barrels every other year like clockwork. They came because the work was good, because a Voss barrel held what you put in it and didn't weep at the seams and didn't swell wrong in the wet and didn't dry crack in the summer. They came because Della Voss charged a fair price and kept her word about when a thing would be ready. But there were others too. A girl named Susie, 12 years old, daughter of a tenant farmer up the hollow, who began appearing at the workshop after school, not asking anything, just watching from the doorway until Della told her to come in and handed her a piece of scrap wood and a draw knife and said, "See if you can take it down even." Susie could not, at first, but she came back. She always came back, and Della taught her the way Edna had taught Della, by doing, by expecting, by letting the work be the teacher. A man named Reuben Castile, who was 68 and had been a wheelwright before his hands went stiff with joint ill, came and sat on a stump near the workshop door on the pretense of resting on his walk to town, and over the course of several weeks began offering observations about the Greer property's spring, about the history of the farm, about which farmers in the hollow had the best white oak and were willing to deal honestly. He asked for nothing and expected nothing, and was the most useful source of local intelligence she encountered. Through Reuben, she learned that the Greer property had once had a second spring, higher, on the slope, that had gone dry when a landslide blocked its source sometime in the 1880s. That the original owner, Silas Greer, had been a man of particular stubbornness and particular generosity, the 2 qualities coexisting in him as they often do in people who are serious about what they do. That the Cooperage had supplied every farm in 3 hollows for 30 years. That when Silas died with no family to take it, people had waited, without quite admitting to themselves that they were waiting, to see what would happen to the shop. Nobody could buy it, Reuben said one afternoon, not looking at her, watching the creek. Nobody who would have done right by it. County had one offer from a man who wanted to tear the workshop down for the stone. Turned him down twice. Della said, "Why did they turn him down?" Reuben was quiet for a moment. Silas would have wanted the work to continue, he said. Some things outlast the person doing them. That was the thing she found in the Greer property. Not gold, not a letter with instructions from the dead. Something quieter, and in its own way more startling, the evidence that people she had never met had already made room for her. That the county clerk had said no to the man who wanted the stone. That Corwin Fitch had held the white oak log. That Luther Payne had handed over a locust post without being asked. That Reuben Castile had walked past the workshop every week for 3 years, watching for the right person, and had recognized her on sight. She hadn't arrived in Cotter's Mill. She had been received by it. This was the thing Edna Marsh had tried to tell her once, and that Della had not understood until now. Competence was the one thing no one could take from you. But competence alone was not enough. What made it matter, what made it last, was the willingness to put it in a place where it could be found by the people who needed it. To show up, to do the work, to let the work be good. Della had not chosen Cotter's Mill for any reason she could have named. She had read a town's name in a dead woman's passing comment, written it in a notebook, and walked toward it when she had nowhere else to go. That was all. And somehow that was enough. The country has a way of finding uses for a woman who can do something real. By the second spring, the porch post had weathered in, and the sagged corner had been straightened with new framing she cut herself from timber. Corwin Fitch brought in his wagon as part of a trade she had stopped trying to understand was fair or not, because in Cotter's Mill, fair was a long-running conversation between people who intended to still be neighbors in 30 years, and she had begun to understand that she was one of them now. Susie Albright, she had learned the girl's last name by then, could raise a small barrel alone. She still didn't have the timing for the hoop setting, that moment when you stop driving and listen. But she was learning to listen. That was the part that couldn't be taught directly. Della knew she would get it eventually because Sussy had the thing underneath. The willingness to do it again when it wasn't right the first time, or the fifth time, or the ninth. Edna Marsh's crows sat on a peg above the workbench. Della used it every day. She had never needed to replace the handle, which was still the same walnut, still the same color of old bone, still shaped by 40 years of one woman's grip and 3 more years of hers. When she reached for it in the morning, she was aware of reaching for something that had come to her through loss, the way most useful things do. She was 24 years old. She had a workshop, a house, a spring, a waiting list, an apprentice who didn't know she was one yet, and a man named Reuben Castile who sat on a stump outside her door and talked about nothing and meant everything. She had $4 worth of land, and a skill that could not be taken from her, and a name in the county that meant something, which was the only kind of name worth having. She had not arrived here looking for any of this. She had arrived with a broken buckled bag and a tool and a composition book full of notes from a dead woman who had known more than she'd let on. It turned out that was enough to start with. Some of us spend our whole lives waiting to be given something. A home, a name, a place that knows us. And some of us, when we have nothing left to lose, simply walk toward the nearest ridge and discover that what we needed was already there, waiting on the other side of the work. We'd like to ask you something before you go. Think about the skill someone passed to you. A parent, a teacher, a neighbor who let you watch when you were young. Is there somewhere that skill is still waiting to be used? Is there a place, a person, a waiting list that hasn't been written yet? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.